Julian on the brown note and why Donald Trump just lost the election. So if you're in Sydney, where the show's based, it's Tuesday, and Sunday night, the New York Times released their latest expose on Donald Trump. Now, there are a number of takeaways from that have gone global, but it's worth pointing out that tonight, American time's the first debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So the timing of this is obviously deliberate, and it's also less than 40 days out from the American election. A bit of overview. Some takeaways. Trump paid $750 in taxes in both 2016 and 2017, and he paid no taxes at all for 10 years out of the preceding 15 years. He lived a lavish lifestyle through business expenses, such as $70,000 on hairstyling during his tenure on The Apprentice. These are just some of the main takeaways from it. Some of his best-known businesses are massively losing tens of millions of dollars. The president's frequently pointed out his far-flung hotels, golf courses, resorts, etc., evidence of his business acumen. Yet these properties have been hemorrhaging money. The Times reports that Mr. Trump has claimed $315 million in losses on his golf courses since 2000, and that's golf courses alone. Likewise, Trump International Hotel in Washington lost $55 million. Foreign visitors help support Trump properties, which is again going to the idea of him using his tenure in office to profit. And he's probably paid his family members about $26 million in unexplained consulting fees, including Ivanka Trump. And if you want to know how accurate all of this is, Ivanka Trump claims $747,622 in payments for consulting, which Trump has had the identical figure leaving the Trump Organization accounts. So this is all pretty... I don't think the New York Times is going to be printing this without having... They say they've got inside information directly from the tax people, and they're not going to reveal who their source is. Trump's lucrative licensing revenue has dried up. He earned $427 million. The only successful business deal he's ever had was the licensing for the Apprentice TV show, but that's dried up now. And Trump's debt load is also coming. You might have heard a lot that he's got about $400 million in personally guaranteed loans, which are due in the next 4 years, which would be the next term in office. On top of that, $100 million mortgage on Trump Tower comes due in 2022. So we're in the $500 million. And he also got a near $80 million refund from the tax office in America. And they've been auditing him for 10 years. So this is why he says he won't release his tax returns, because they've been auditing him. If he loses that audit, he'll be due to pay about another $100 million. So he doesn't have the money to pay any of this. Now, that's one side of it. I mean, if you're not a Trump cultist, we knew that he was a corrupt businessman, and we knew he was worthless. I've seen reports on his wealth go from he owns something like $200 million to he's over $1 billion in debt. It would seem that the latter is far more accurate. Apparently, he was bailed out to the tune of $1 billion in the 1990s. And those loans, a lot of which came through Deutsche Bank, are still subject to a lot of scrutiny. Famously, he entered office refusing to release his tax returns. I said at the time, all the way back in 2016, that isn't so much because he's a criminal, evidently he is, but it's because that he is worth so little money. And he has lost so much money. And he projects this idea that he's worth billions of dollars, but he's not. He's worth nothing. All his businesses go bankrupt or lose money, apart from The Apprentice, which he got kicked off of anyway. He can't even do that anymore. And no one wants to show that show because it's become so tarnished. And the New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 on Trump's taxes again. The financial history of Trump is one where he says he's been given, a few $1 million loans in the 1980s from his dad. Now, we now know that from about the age of 10, he was receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars tax-free from his dad each year. And the total amount of money he probably got from his dad by the time his dad passed away was probably north of $400 million. So the notion that he got a few property deals out of his dad in the 1980s is a complete lie. He got hundreds of millions of dollars in benefit out of his dad, and he appears to have lost all of it. So the notion that he's this big business guy, he probably hasn't ever made any money to any notable extent on business. That's all the more interesting given that you would have to be virtually the most incompetent businessman alive to have had tens of millions of dollars at your disposal in the 1980s in New York property and come out losing. Because New York property, under economic neoliberalism, which gives property developers and property investors so much money and massively increase the value in property in places like New York and London. If you own property in New York and you still aren't a multi-billionaire by the end of the 80s or by the end of the 90s, where property has dramatically exploded, you are doing something seriously wrong. And all of this goes to his whole notion of him being a narcissist, a narcissistic sociopath. And the big common misnomer about narcissism is it's someone that loves himself, when it's really somebody that quite probably hates themselves and is utterly terrified of what people think of them. And the narcissist is someone that is solely concerned with what other people think of them, what they think of themselves and what other people think of them. And it manifests itself with zero empathy, having absolutely no natural empathy for another human being, which is they're pretty common. You don't tell people you can run the fastest and jump the highest if you are completely comfortable in yourself. You do these because you're worried that people don't think good of you. And Trump's shown that his whole life. And I thought one of the most telling psychological examples was this story. In May 1984, an official from the Trump Organization called to tell me, and this is Jonathan Greenberg from Forbes magazine, who did the Forbes richest people list. An official from the Trump Organization called to tell me how rich Donald Trump was. I was reporting for the Forbes 400, the magazine's annual ranking of America's rich people for the third year. In the previous edition, we valued Trump's holdings at $200 million, only 1/5 of what he claimed in interviews. This time, his aide urged me on the phone I needed to understand just how loaded Trump was. The official was called John Barron, a name we now know as an alter ego of Trump. When I recently rediscovered and listened for the first time that year to tapes I made of this and other phone calls, I was amazed I didn't see through the ruse. Although Trump altered some cadences and affected a slightly stronger New York accent, it was clearly him. Barron told me Trump had taken possession of the business he ran with his father. Most of the assets have been consolidated to Mr. Trump, he said. And he lied to Forbes to get in their rich list by claiming that all of his dad's properties were his. Now, that should tell you all you need to know about Trump. But none of that's interesting for me because I knew he was a con man. I knew how many businesses that he'd been involved in have gone bankrupt and how few seem to have been successful. And I said years ago that he wouldn't release his tax returns because it would reveal how unsuccessful he'd been as a businessman. I've also said that he was financially indebted in a way that means that he shouldn't be a president because he owes people so much money that makes him liable to act in a manner that is unbecoming of being a president. And we don't really know who he owes all this money to, and there's a lot of speculation that it's foreign, entities in Russia and so on. But none of this is why he's just lost the election. The reason he's lost the election is this: optics. Now, optics are very dangerous politically because they can take a story that is utterly meaningless, like Hillary Clinton's emails, and they can turn them into a signifier, which then becomes all-dominating and you can't escape from. Hillary Clinton's email scandal, Benghazi, these weren't big stories, really, based on the content. They were nothing stories, but they fitted a paradigm. And they fitted a paradigm that Hillary Clinton was this completely untrustworthy person that she then projected. She never came across as a trustworthy person. Some politicians are brilliant at lying, like Donald Trump, because they're narcissists or sociopaths. And they can tell the truth because they themselves believe it. A narcissist will tell you the truth that they need. That's how they can completely backflip on things without... And Scott Morrison, I would call a narcissist. They can lie with absolute conviction. I've experienced this in my own private life. They lie as though they are telling the truth. You cannot differentiate between them lying and telling the truth. Hillary Clinton's a terrible liar. She's one of these politicians that's got it behind her eyes. So that all fit with her really well, and the optics of that email scandal were bad. The trouble Trump's got here, the last election came down to 3 swing states. And they were 3 swing states where Democrat voters turned for the first time, often since the 1980s, to the Republican Party. And they did so because their economic fortunes had declined year on year for decades, and no one had cared about them, and they were all blue-collar Democrats, often in unionized counties, and running to the Republican Party, who are absolutely opposed to unionization and would do nothing to help them. So they must have been really annoyed. And it was only down to 60,000 votes, I think, across 3 states that swung those 3 states towards Trump and won him the election. It was a tiny percentile of the vote. And the reason he's just lost the election is this. Those blue-collar voters are going to look at this, and the optics require very simplistic things to make them work. And here, it's that Trump paid $750 in tax. That is something that sticks, because they will look at how much tax they've paid, and they will look at that figure of $750. And then they will look at the fact that Trump's pushed through tax cuts that only really benefit billionaires and corporations, and that he himself has been paying far less tax than they have been paying and done really nothing for them. And this is 40 days out from an election, less than that. So that's why I think that he's lost the election, because this is something that will play very, very badly to blue-collar, working-class Democrat voters that went for Trump last time are now going to be looking at his tax bill of $750, and they're going to be going, what? And I think that has cost him the election. I mean, it may have gone that way anyway, and there might have been a lot of other things that came through, but I think the optics on that is going to turn so many of these disaffected Democrats away from Trump, because it plays so well. It attacks everything that he projects about himself. It attacks the notion that he's a strong businessman. I think we all know that he isn't, but it makes it very clear that he's lost money hand over fist, but it also is a figure that you can relate to your own paycheck. And the fact is, he's paid probably 1/10 of the tax that most of these voters have paid in a year. And they look at things like $70,000 for hairstyling and paying his daughter and all of those things. They're part of it. But the fact that he has that $750 figure when he took office is really bad optics. And the fact that he paid no income tax before that. These are the optics that I think will sink Donald Trump. They're going to look at their paycheck and they're going to look at his tax bill and they're going to go, you son of a bitch. So that's why I think that Trump's just lost the election and that this won't go away from him.